Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. So we're running a rerun for our Christmas break here. One of our fan favorite episodes about It's a Wonderful Life, a classic Christmas.
My favorite film.
Yeah, a classic Christmas movie. Everyone loves it. Most people, at least. So we just wanted to wish everyone happy holidays, Merry War on Christmas, and hope that you're, staying healthy and well, and have a good 2023.
Absolutely. Hope the holidays are good to all of you, and we really appreciate you. We really hope that that this is a time that gives everybody what they need, whether it's rest, time with family, friends. So if you haven't heard this episode, hope you enjoy it. If you have, might enjoy listening to it again. But either way, we'll see you in the next episode after this one.
Yeah. Oh, and one last thing. I'm going to post a link in the episode description to an essay by Clare Coffey about a friend of the pod about It's a Wonderful Life, and Mary in particular, that I think captures a part of the film that we didn't notice at the time, but it's very, very good. I highly recommend it. It's also a great Christmas read.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thanks, Claire. Fantastic. Good looking out there, Ryan. And, we should probably tell people about the American Prospect for those that don't know, on the off chance.
Yeah. Yeah. This podcast is sponsored by the American Prospect. Subscribe at $10 a month, get a free digital subscription and a discounted print subscription, or $5 a month will get you just our bonus episodes. But
our vast collection.
We have quite a few of them at this point. But other than that, you could just rate, review, or listen, whatever you want. And we appreciate any feedback or downloads that you happen to give us. So happy holidays again, and we'll be seeing you in 2023.
But he did help a few people get out of your slums, Mr. Potter. And what's wrong with that? Probably. Here, you're all businessmen here. Don't it make them better citizens? Doesn't it make them better customers? You said that what'd you say just a minute ago? They had to wait and save their money before they even thought of a decent home? Wait for what? Until their children grow up and leave them? Until they're so old and broken down that do you know how long it takes a working man to save $5,000? Just remember this, Mr. Potter, that this rabble you're talking about, they do most of the working and paying and living and dying in this community. Well, is it too much to have them work and pay and live and die in a couple of decent rooms and a bath? Anyway, my father didn't think so. People were human beings to him, but to you, a warped, frustrated old man, they're cattle. Well, in my book, he died a much richer man than you'll ever be.
I'm not interested in your book. I'm talking about the building and loan.
I know very well what you're talking about. You're talking about something you can't get your fingers on, and it's galling you. That's what you're talking about, I know. Well, I've said too much. You're the board here. You do what you want with this thing. There's just one thing more, though. This town needs this measly one-horse institution, if only to have some place where people can come without crawling to Potter. Come on.
Welcome back to Left Anchor. I'm Alexi the Greek.
And I'm Ryan Cooper. We're here today with a special holiday episode about one of our, I think both of our, among our favorite movies, we should say, maybe Alexi's favorite of all time, but
it's true.
An American classic, which, I grew up watching this every Christmas. It's one that's like broadcast, I think on network television, it was a real tradition there, but It's a Wonderful Life. Like everybody, I think just about has seen it at least once, if not more than once. And I think it really holds up. And I think, it's one of the few movies that I've seen since I was a kid. When I was a kid, I really liked it. I thought it was a great film. And I think it's only grown in my esteem as time has gone on. And I've understood some of the nuances, and the basic message of the film has only become more and more relevant over the years. And we rewatched it a couple days ago, it captures something. It's almost most brutal of all. I think we'll get into it. Watching it during the pandemic and during the presidency of Donald Trump, and the way that it illustrates so much, so many like parts of the fabric of American society that used to be there, you know, in some way or another. You know, the thing used to function a lot better than it does today. And it really drives home how much is missing in our crumbling imperial monstrosity. And yeah. I'll tell you about it as soon as I can get my cat off my notes here.
Well, I certainly don't want to suggest that, you know, as with many classic films, there's the caveat that this is not in the spirit of Make America Great Again, as if there's an atavistic desire to go back to a kind of Eden that existed or something. And it's not about that, because, you know, as we've talked about, whether it was the New Deal and kind of certain kind of racist compromises that had to come with it, you know, our history as a country has always been fraught, but more as a film that has a message and captures a kind of spirit and a kind of understanding of how humanity and society and political action really should function to serve people and to serve kindness and love and sacrifice rather than greed and corruption and ugliness. I think it's kind of, you know, a poignant and meaningful film to capture a certain kind of Christmas spirit that, in the depths of the pandemic, there have been a lot of beautiful, sacrificial, things that have been done by people, but also a lot of kind of ugliness and of course the failure of the state in so many ways that's reflected a kind of ugliness and a kind of corrupted spirit that is the opposite of the Christmas spirit that I think provides a good basis for discussion about what this film could teach us today, and why, at least for me, it was quite an emotional experience to rewatch it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so maybe, you know, with some kind of like introductory remarks out of the way, we could, you know, kind of go through it. You know, maybe folks haven't seen it, or maybe they haven't seen it in a long time.
Right. Go over the plot.
But yeah, you know, so it's about a fellow named George Bailey. He's the protagonist. George Bailey is the son of a, I guess you'd call him a financier. He's a
savings and loan guy. Yeah.
He runs a savings and loan. Those things used to be much more common back in the day, but, you know, basically taking money from savers and lending it out, doing your classic financial intermediation, and, to build homes. And, you know, this fellow, George's father, is always struggling against a, you know, capitalist banker named Mr. Potter, who starts the movie when George is very young, as like an old guy with white hair in a wheelchair, and ends the movie as the exact same old guy in white hair, you know, just sort of like the right. Ageless capitalist who's always the same and who never has any scruples, ever. But so, you know, basically, you know, George has to, you know, spoiler alert, George has all these big ambitions. Yeah. He wants to go to college. He wants to travel the world, and he keeps not being able to do that because things in his hometown, Bedford Falls, if I forgot to mention, the circumstance keeps pulling him back. He wants to go to Europe, and then his father dies, and he has to like clean up affairs. And then, you know, he makes this noble speech saying, don't give the building and loan to Mr. Potter, because he's just going to turn it into this like slumlord thing. And then they say, okay, but you have to run it. And so he has to give that up. And then his brother comes back, and you know, he's going to marry this lady whose father's going to give him a great job. And so,
and meanwhile, and back up a second, because meanwhile he let his brother go to college, right, because there wasn't enough money. There wasn't enough money for both of them to go to college. So he put off for 4 years working at the savings and loan, right, yes, so his brother could go, right. And then his brother was supposed to take over when he came back, but because he got married, his new father-in-law offered him this new job and an opportunity, and so George again defers to the good of his brother and gives up his dream once again, right, a recurring theme.
He never goes to college. He marries his, you know, a high school sweetheart, or, you know, a local girl. They live in a sort of drafty old house, that she fixes up. And, it's a tale of sort of frustrated ambition, right? There's many more details to it. But, George is a guy who sort of grew up on tales of adventure. As a kid, they show him, reading National Geographic and
right,
he's
right.
making all these plans. He wants to do something big. There's a scene where a critical scene, actually, I think, where he's talking to his father, before he dies and telling him, it's like, if I had to spend my whole life trying to save 3 cents on a length of pipe, I think I'd bust,
Right.
And his dad's like, well, in a small way, I think we're doing a bit of good, and I think that he gets roped into basically doing the same thing as his father did. And, that's sort of where it stands. There's a famous, like the big, conflict in the plot comes when, George's, business partner, Uncle Billy, loses. He is a notoriously forgetful guy, like basically incompetent business.
Drunk.
Yeah, drinks too much, can't remember anything. He loses $8,000. He accidentally gives it to Mr. Potter, who of course keeps it. And then, the bank examiner is going to come by the way, isn't that a quaint little thing? Imagine a bank examiner coming and immediately finding when someone has an $8,000 loss that they can't explain. That like, oh, you're going to go to jail because you broke the law as a banker.
But
wow.
Isn't there something quite accurate though about how like the people with less, like Lady Fortune seems to screw them over, whereas the Potters of the world are not only like mendacious and actually bad actors and contributing to the harm of oppressing and miserating people, but they are not caught when he basically stole the $8,000, right? He basically
did.
like, yeah.
He got it by accident, but it's like you found a wallet on the street or something and you picked it up and you knew who it was and you didn't give it back. I mean, that's no different from taking it.
Yeah. And instead he uses that misfortune of Uncle Billy in order to set up George Bailey, who of course, in like George fashion, just immediately takes the blame, right, for the missing money.
Yeah. Well, he tells Uncle Billy that he's, it's like this means scandal and prison and somebody's going to pay for this and it's not going to be me. But then he takes it all on his shoulders. Yeah. So he's going to kill himself. He's thinking about killing himself because he has a life insurance policy. And then this angel comes down and the angel flings himself into this river, or on the bridge where he's standing at, knowing that George's, selflessness will kick in and he'd jump in and save him because that's what he does. He can't help himself. George says he wishes that he'd never been born. And the angel grants his wish, and he sees what would have become of Bedford Falls had he never been born. And the answer is that, like, Bedford Falls got the shock doctrine neoliberalism done to it.
Yeah, it's Pottersville. It became Pottersville.
It's run as an economic dictatorship. It's a very harsh and unforgiving place. This is a little bit sort of cliched in the way that it's presented because it's all like, speakeasies and girls and dancing. And it's like, oh, this is, so it's like the indications of what sort of bad society means is a little bit out of date. But what they're gesturing at, what Capra, Frank Capra, the director, I haven't mentioned that either. He's gesturing at is this is a place where like the social contract has been destroyed deliberately and people don't look out for each other anymore. And it's all about like short-term hedonism and fuck the poor. And we don't care about anyone but ourselves and our short-term kicks.
Well, and frankly, the causation is pretty easy to see because the Baileys basically were the only force that countered Potter's ability to basically, like neoliberalism, destroy every social fabric and to take over every institution in town, right? And so like you could easily say, well, of course Potter would have the speakeasy and the girls and all, because those are the things that would make the money, right? Like it's purely because these are the things that would create a lot of consumption, particularly in a way that would be high profit margins. It just so happens that those very kinds of things would also destroy certain relationships in small businesses and certain ways of life that happen to coincide with kind of corroding the soul at the same time and becoming more like Potter in the doing of it, right? But so you have this image of a whole city, and then again this brings me back to like Plato's Republic. Like the soul in the city is like a microcosm and macrocosm, and so the Pottersville is just like a macrocosm of what happens to certain individuals that become unrecognizable to George and who they've become, right? And they're still the same people, but because he wasn't in their lives and because he didn't influence other people who influenced them, you see how like you pull the thread, right? And that like dissembles, right? It just kind of tears apart, like you say, the social fabric in a way. And it's this dystopian vision that I think is really terrifying, but I think convincing to me anyway.
No, we live in Pottersville now. Our society sucks in the same way that Pottersville sucks, basically. And I think the interesting thing is that it's not the politics of it are not Marxist in any real sense, but it is a kind of like economic determinist picture of society. It says, with this counterfactual that everyone's character is to a very great degree downstream of their economic circumstances. So, for example, he talks about the character of the taxi driver Ernie. He ends up, he's a taxi driver in both realities. But he's lives in a shack, and his wife left him with the kid, and he's now a suspicious, sort of paranoid guy. Nick, the bartender, in the first reality, he is, he's an employee of the immigrant fellow Martini, and he's a sort of kindly bartender. He looks after George when he's having a bad time, and he's praying to God to help him out. When in the other reality, he's this like hard bitten, like just sort of whiskey salesman. And the fact of like the sort of his ownership position in the social context of just like serving, a bunch of like, hard bitten people has made him into an asshole, who throws George out.
Right, because the establishment, right, is a reflection of what's required in Pottersville, and what's required in Pottersville is to have a place, like as Nick says, to serve hard liquor to men who want to get drunk fast.
Yep.
And why do they want to get drunk fast? Because life fucking sucks.
Yep.
Right. And so if you have to fill the market need for that, then you become the kind of hard person who serves hard liquor for depressed people, and that makes you a fucking asshole too.
Yep.
Right.
Bert the cop goes from like Nordic policeman who is basically looking after everybody. The guy who sang outside of George's window with Ernie, the taxi driver, Bert and Ernie. That's very funny. I'm not sure if Sesame Street comes from that or if that's just a coincidence.
I think so. I kind of assume, right?
Yeah. But he like a guy who like, the cliched policeman, the guy who like gets cats down from trees and stuff like that, into a modern policeman who is always pulling his gun, who's beating the shit out of people.
He opens fire on George Bailey in the middle of town.
Yeah, in a crowded street, people are like ducking and covering. I mean, it's disturbingly relevant. I know.
I looked at that. I'm like, oh, this is accurate. This is actually like, this is today. And he's like manhandling, was it Violet, right? He's manhandling, Violet, who he obviously knows. She's a known entity in town, and he's like throwing her into the paddy wagon.
Yeah. Uncle Billy is in a insane asylum. Lack of decent employment and no place to go. He lost his business, obviously, because he could not compete with Potter. and that was the end of his, his mental health. I think, you could draw it out, but that sort of like gets the drives the point home that, the social fabric, it is
tenuous, right?
Well, it's all about what people are doing on a day-to-day basis and what they are doing, in a, majority or something of their waking lives is economic stuff. They're going to work, they're buying things. And so the character of your economic relations is incredibly influential in how, your society ends up, being.
Right.
And
you're formed by it.
Yeah, exactly. And so I thought, that is like a really radical, type, even though, it's not Marxist. I would say it's not. I don't know if you'd say anti-socialist.
It's definitely populist.
Yeah, populist, antitrust, anti-monopoly. I think would be.
I think it certainly has socialist principles at the core of the message.
Yeah.
Right. So it depends how you define socialism, but like socialism or social democratic principles are certainly at the core of what it's describing and imaging. Right.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This like a basic egalitarian impulse. That's that is the heart of kind of socialism. Like in my view, like we're doing like economic production. Everybody should share in that. But
it's deeper than that though, right? Because it's not just talking about like taxation and distribution. It's talking about like the way that the economic mode of production bleeds into subject formation and social relations.
Yeah, sure.
and actually, right. So in a sense, it is quite Marxist in a certain sense, right? Like in terms of the depth of analysis that it's reaching beyond just like, oh, inequality is bad because people are poor.
You could,
right? It's saying like it's a spiritual transformation that occurs. Right?
Yeah. You could say it's a Marxist Brandeisian,
sure.
type of synthesis. Right. Because of the political economy, they're not talking about the welfare state necessarily. And it's
battling this monopoly, right? Battling this, which is also a metaphor though for a certain kind of capitalist ethos, I think.
Yeah, right. I mean, the capitalist ethos. The capitalist,
but exactly.
It's just the profit is all that matters. It's about returns, and there's a great scene where Potter is talking with. I'll have to splice in a bunch of scenes where Potter's talking with
the board or what?
No, he's talking with the father, and the father's saying like, "Oh, you can't put people out on the street," and he says they're not my children. It's like they're somebody's children.
They're somebody's children. Yeah.
Are you running a business or a charity ward?
Well, no. And he has contempt for the Baileys. He thinks because as the capitalist, he thinks they're weak. There's almost this Darwinistic kind of makes me think of Corey Robin on Nietzsche and Hayek and kind of like the Darwinian approach to evaluating things like, Potter just thinks that the Baileys are weak. They hardly make a profit. They give their friends loans because they're their friends. What kind of way to run a business is that? Right. Meanwhile, he has no compunction about defrauding, stealing, whatever you have to do. But the true like protagonist and antagonist conflict is the Baileys and then George Bailey especially, but it's kind of like Star Wars, in a certain way, right? Because like there's a scene with the father at the table. It's the same scene, I think. Well, I don't actually remember if it's the same scene, but it's a scene where, George asks what the problem with Potter is. And his father basically says, he hates everyone because he can't stand, other people having what he doesn't have. He wants what other people have.
Yeah.
And he says he's a sick man. Then he says, I guess he hates us most of all. Right. And so I thought that was a really revealing thing. Okay. So he hates people who have what he doesn't have. And that means he hates the Baileys most of all. And so what do the Baileys have that he doesn't have? Right. Like, so like love, care for others, the opposite of egocentrism, narcissism, greed, and just, thirst for that tyrannical spirit, the thirst just for your own power and aggrandizement and wealth. And he doesn't know what it would be like to care for others and to be outward driven. And that's this light and dark contrast. And I think it's a figurative contrast between what I would say socialist principles versus capitalist principles. Everyone out for themselves, right? Atomized, the profit motive. If everyone just seeks their own good, the invisible hand will jerk everyone off or whatever, versus a socialist principle. And what George Bailey, despite him saying at all these frustrating moments, and I think you're a bit unfair to George because you say he keeps being like kept back. And that takes away, I think, a little bit of his agency because there's these moments where he chooses every time, right? He chooses. His agency is enacted. And because as much as he gets frustrated and shakes Uncle Billy and says, it's not going to be me going to jail, he actually knows that he's the guy that will go to jail because that's who he is. And just because he says, all I want, he like shakes Mary at one point, his love interest, all I want is to do what I want to do, right? I want to do what I want to do.
Yeah.
and the truth is who he is someone who actually wants to do what other people need and what other people, want, right? Because he wants to serve. That's who he is. And that's the beautiful dichotomy. And you see the kind of world shaped by people who ultimately care more for service and for others and for the community than they do for their own good. That produces Bedford Falls. And those that actually, no matter how smart or powerful they are, just seek their own good, that turns into Pottersville.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that the story of the character arc of George is him basically becoming reconciled with his own deepest motivation, which is to serve others. And, in the course of that, be served by them, like to be part of
there's a reciprocity. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. An important scene we haven't mentioned yet is the bank run. Really, quite a great, depiction of how bank runs happen before the FDIC, made them, eradicated them basically from normal banking operations, at least. And, so there's a run on the bank, and then that spreads to the building and loan. People, have a liquidity fear, and so they all come to get their money out of the building and loan at the same time. And George has to explain, we don't have that much cash here at the bank, at the building and loan. In fact, the bank already took all of it, because they called in a loan. And, so, the money's not here. He says, it's over in, the Mrs. Micklin's house. We're putting your money to work, as FDR said in his first fireside chat. And so they're going to run, and they're going to go to Potter, who's going to pay them 50 cents on the dollar for all their shares and take over the building and loan. And George talks them out of it. And and then he has to, his wife volunteers their honeymoon money to tide everyone over until the bank reopens for in a week.
Yes.
And so he gives another thing he gives up willingly.
This is honeymoon.
Yeah.
Yes.
And in that moment, which is very interesting, he is excited to do it. He's like, yes,
He's thrilled.
I got $2,000, And, but the reciprocity angle of that also comes through, because there's one guy who's selfish and he says, I want everything.
Yes.
I want $242, and that's not going to break anybody. False. That he almost does break
that's right.
But,
because they end up with $2 only, right? Yeah.
And then a couple of people later, they're going through turns. There's 40 or 50 people in the building and loan, and they're sharing out this $2,000. And a couple of people down the line, there's a woman who says, "Can I have $1,750?"
Right.
And George kisses her, and it's that, it's like, oh, that's a nice little thing. But then, as you say, they have $2 left. If she had not done.
Because people right before her asked for $20.
Yeah.
If she'd just gone for because he asked, how much do you really need for a week?
Yeah.
In other words, in the spirit of realizing that this institution serves all of us, your money is in his house, your money is in her house. And if we fall, then Potter will create, these, terrible houses that he will charge you all kinds of these slums. And if you want to avoid the slums, we have to band together. And if she had been unthinking and not really calculated what she needed, if maybe she sacrificed a little, then everything would have fallen apart, right? So it's not just George who has the threat if you pull it, if he doesn't do things. It's so many people, if they don't do the thing that actually serves others and recognizes the interdependence, then everything could fall apart in that moment, right?
Yeah. And this, I think, another, kind of message of the film is that heroism individually is much exaggerated in the popular imagination, because George really, he wants to be like a big guy. He wants, he has this idea in his head.
Engineer and architect. He wants to build things. Yeah. Be a great man.
Yeah. And the film is kind of undercutting that. It's saying that, not necessarily that those things don't happen, that there aren't like figureheads, but that all those figureheads are a social creation. They all depend on, infinite layers of people beneath them who are doing, all these, different things. And, it's that comes through in the lady who only asked for $17.50. It comes through in how, the Bert and Ernie go and sing to George on his wedding night after he sacrifices his honeymoon to save the building and loan, and it comes through in the story of his brother Harry, who ends up he's like a war hero. He goes to war in World War II, and he gets he becomes a fighter pilot, and he shoots down a bunch of German planes and saves a transport full of people. And, it ends up, he gets a Congressional Medal of Honor. That's right. But earlier in the film, you learned that when he was a little boy, he fell in an icy hole in a stream and almost drowned.
That's right.
And George saved him at the cost of his own
life.
hearing, which is what prevented George
from going to war.
Exactly.
So he can't be a war hero. And also remember that Sam Wainwright, his high school buddy, becomes rich and offered him to get in on the ground floor. And because of his obligations to Bedford Falls, he also couldn't do that. And he would have been rich if he had done that. Yeah. Right?
Instead, he suggests that Wainwright should locate the factory in Bedford Falls at an old tool works that has been abandoned.
Instead of Rochester. That's right.
Yeah. And so when George is shown the alternate history by the angel Clarence, it's shown that Harry Bailey died when he was 9. He drowned in the river, and so all the people on the transport died, and none of those planes were shot down. Because George wasn't there to save him when he needed to be saved, and so it's like that. We really, American culture has a tendency to valorize the individual hero, but it's every single person who's ever existed is just, the figure, like the result of this inescapable network of dependency. And, even especially maybe the most obvious, most prominent people who get the most attention, and have the most money and success. They're the ones who have the biggest and most elaborate support networks.
Now, the film ends, get this, right? The film ends with, George, first of all, not caring that he might go to jail, with him not caring about anything and embracing the beautiful life that he's had and his joy that everyone is as happy and healthy as they are. And sure, he gets rescued by everyone giving the money at the end. But notice that his brother Harry, right, gives up his own parade and his own celebration to join the celebration for George. And Sam Wainwright wires up to $25,000, right? And the hero businessman, not just Potter, who is the kind of crony capitalist or whatever, but Sam Wainwright, the kind of all-American good guy who just really, built his own fortune from the ground up, right? And is as good a guy as you can imagine. So that kind of capitalist, that kind of entrepreneur, and the war hero and Sam are coexisting in this scene with George Bailey, where it is pronounced, the cheer at the end is to George Bailey, the richest man in town, right?
Yeah.
So the person actually to be valorized is not the war hero. It's not even the good capitalist. It's George Bailey, right? The friend to man.
Yeah. Because, he's a guy who is most dedicated to looking after his fellow citizens. And that
the true citizen, that's it. That's the word, citizen. He's a citizen.
He's not a guy who does great deeds necessarily, but he's a guy like in a sort of cliched sense, or in a sense of adventure books,
superhuman.
He's just doing the tiny small kindnesses and little
sacrifices.
To preserve the sort of social fabric and try to cut in the like ordinary person in a share of the economic prosperity created by the community. And it's unglamorous most of the time and unrewarding.
We forgot he turned down an offer. So again, Potter realizes that the only thing standing in his way to basically monopolizing the whole town is the Baileys and George Bailey specifically. And so he's like, okay, you know what? I'm going to bribe him. And so he basically tries to buy him and says, you know what? I want you to run everything for me. I'll pay you $20,000 a year. When he already in the build up to this basically figured out that maybe, George Bailey's making $40. George says, no, $45 a week.
Yeah.
And then he says, okay, so you're pocketing maybe $10 a week now. Once kids come along, you'll pocket nothing. And he offers him $20,000 a year, right? A 3-year contract starting today. Boom. Right.
Yeah.
And he gets enticed by it. This is the classic temptation, right? Of the devil.
Yeah.
And he, right. And so he starts to really to think about how great life would be to actually finally have some relief from the stress and the crises and actually have, the travel to Europe and all that. But then just his conscience kicks back in and he rejects it. And so like time and time again, you have somebody who's, as you say, his evolution is to find out what his deepest desire really is, because who he is in his commitments to his family, his friends, his community, to serving justice as against, those powers that would immiserate, those ugly people like Potter, who would try to take away the simple ability for people to live with dignity and with a home that's a nice home that doesn't, crush them. And these are the simple, so socialism is a vision of, as Corey Robin wrote in the title to one of his pieces, right? Converting hysterical, misery into ordinary unhappiness or something like that.
Yeah.
I'm probably mixing up but like something that gives you that impression that it's like, just like, let people have basic dignity and ability to live and cultivate friendships and relationships and not be just under the boot of the kind of immiserating capitalist. Right. And that simple, moral courage to step in and say, nope, this is not okay. I guess I'm the one that has to be here to fight for justice. I don't want to. I'm not here for glory. I would rather go travel the world. But at the core, I can't deny my love of other and my love of community and family and my being bound up in relationships. And then the reciprocity that flows from that to show that he's the richest man in town, that he has a wonderful life because of those commitments and those relationships that were concretized, throughout that time and throughout those crises. it's a beautiful message of how simple the good life can really be, and how all the extravagance of a complicated capitalist world and all the ambitions that it tries to foster are really just, boy, temptation towards a really corrupted, ugly life. And one that I think I cried throughout most of this film this time, because I gotta say, this never happened to me before. I think it's because of the pandemic and everything. I must have just been viscerally reacting to the basic goodness, that has been so destroyed, by capitalism and by the structures that form the people that we live amongst today. And there are kind of these pockets of beauty and goodness, but it's just, it's so sad to see how simple, the good life is, how simple devotion to your community, to your family, to others, and how the kind of principles of sacrifice and basic moral courage, have been just so destroyed and seem like such a utopia.
Yeah. Yeah. Now that scene you mentioned, is one reason why I think, is a great film, because George is a fairly complicated character. He has this deep, desire to help others, but he's also, he's not a saint. He gets angry. He's resentful over, his own sort of dreams being thwarted. He's proud, and that, that it harms him in some ways, but it also saves him in some ways. And in that scene with Potter, it really kind of comes out that, his pride and his anger is what saves him, because he looks at the idea of Potter, and it's like, it's sorely tempting. It's like, boy, wouldn't this be great? And then he gets pissed. He's like, fuck
that's
this, and he yells at
Thumos. That's, by the way, that's what Thumos is, by the way.
Yeah.
Thumos is that part of the soul that gets angry at injustice.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like, I won't be bought. I'm going to keep my dignity, even if it keeps me poor and living in this shitty house and not being able to buy my kids all the best stuff, because fuck you. I'm not going to be, I'm not a pound of fish at the market, for sale at the low
not
price.
Not to be instrumentalized. That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
And, that it comes out like when he's at his lowest point, when he's going to, when he's considering suicide, and he's lost his money, and he's yelling at his kids. It's like you see the downside of the temper coming out, but it's like, human beings are like this, he's not a cruel man, but he's a real person, and a real person who, when he's under tremendous strain, isn't a, sort of Christ-like figure, and has to learn.
And not only that, but he couldn't, he came home having just bore the brunt of this news that Uncle Billy fucked it up. And now he, without talking to anyone, he's going to just go to jail for Uncle Billy. And he's not even going to reveal this to his wife. He's just like unable to communicate what's wrong with his day. He's just internally processing it.
Very right? 1940s masculine type of problem.
Sure.
Yeah.
And yet when his wife correctly gets mad at him for his temper tantrum and upsetting the children, you see his face when his wife, he thinks, obviously, turns on him. And that was the last. So for me, it broke my heart, because I was like, okay, the last straw was that his wife got mad at him on this day that he was having. And it's like,
he
okay,
knew it was his fault. Yeah. He fucked up. He took it out on his wife and kids. And was like, I got to get out of here.
No, and so he bought into this lie that it was better for him to be dead than alive. And then when Clarence comes along, he says, okay, maybe that's not true. Maybe it's just better if I'd never been born. Right. And I think there's something to how we can be blinded, right? How trauma, can blind us to the good that we have and what we've done. And it distorts things.
Yeah. And you could say in that moment, that's the, sort of final little piece of the reciprocity coming back again, because he doesn't ask for help, even when he needs it. But his wife goes out and talks to Uncle Billy, figures out what the problem is, and she helps, scours all over town looking for money.
Yes.
And then
and so does everyone else. Everyone else.
That brings the entire town. Even the greedy guy from the bank run who wanted his $242. He comes in to give some money. And so
that's right.
Yeah. And once he is
now, to be fair to George, he's at Martini's right before he tries to commit suicide. He does pray. He says, "I'm not a praying man, but God, show me the way," basically. Like, so I think there is something important to, at the end of his rope, he admits he loses the pride. He says, I don't know what to do. Help me.
After he's left his house. Yeah. He goes for a drink.
So I think there's something important in that, because at the bottom, if we can't admit our dependence on others, we're lost.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
And so he had been the one that others depended on, but at the end of his rope, he finally said, "I am lost. I need help." And then he went to jump off the bridge, but like Clarence the angel was the response, not just to his prayers, but the prayers of others. And I think there's something important in that like, he wasn't the hero of everyone, right? He wasn't the guy who thinks I don't need anybody's help. He also was at a loss and said, I don't know what to do. I'm at help me.
Yeah.
And then people did, right?
He didn't know how to ask. He's not against it. I mean, because to be truly against like the help of others is to be Mr. Potter.
Yes,
because
that's right.
You cannot escape interdependency, but what you can do is establish a domination. You can exploit other people, and you could force them to produce surplus for your benefit through coercion.
This is why Hegel and then Marx and then Martin Hogland, the master-slave dialectic basically says that the master is not ever free because he's totally dependent on the slave. Right. And like, there's a sense in which, emancipation is both emancipation for the master and the slave, because domination is not actually any kind of freedom at all. And the true freedom that we have is in recognizing our interdependence and our dependence and living into the commitments of those relationships that form us and that we depend upon. Let me read a part of the Hogland This Life that I've been thinking about after I watched the film, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So Hogland writes here, he says, to be clear, the emphasis on my own life or your own life is not in opposition to sociality. As Marx underlines, quote, "My own existence is social activity, and therefore that which I make of myself for society and with the awareness of myself as a social being. Hence, to own your life is not to be independent, but to be able to acknowledge your dependence. A good example is the experience of love. When you love someone, a friend, as a parent, as a life partner, your dependence on the other is not a restriction that prevents you from being free. Rather, your dependence on the other belongs to the life you affirm as your own. Acting on behalf of the one you love is not an alien purpose, but the expression of a commitment in which you can recognize yourself. Since caring for the interests and the well-being of the other is part of your own understanding of who you are. Likewise, if the work you do is for the sake of something you believe in as an end in itself, as it is for me when I teach my classes or when I write this book, then even the difficult or exhausting demands of the work are not an external imposition on a prior freedom. On the contrary, the demands of my students and the difficulties of my writing are an intrinsic part of the form of life to which I am committed." So I think, in expounding his kind of vision of democratic socialism, you see this idea that freedom is in the choices we make and the commitments we make who tell us and define who we are. And those commitments are as much about who to sacrifice for and what to serve and who to do work for. And in choosing those things in our finite life, we actually form ourselves, and that's where meaning is to be found. And it's like the discovery of George Bailey in this film is the discovery that he all along is someone who had committed to these people, to this community, to these lives. And you know, him being the richest man at the end who discovered the meaning of his own life is the discovery of someone who had already done the service, the commitments, and in a way had created a meaningful life and simply had to be aware of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's the sort of message of the title, I guess. It's a wonderful life. The angel Clarence says, I think you've had a wonderful life. And all he had to do was reconcile himself to that fact. And once he realizes it, you know, the perspective changes, and, you know, the community comes to, you know, bail him out basically with some money. But even before that happens, he is, you know, completely, you know, his attitude has changed entirely. And he's, you know, full of joy at the prospect of being back, you know, in the real town with his wife and children and so on. And, you know, that's why I think the ending, you know, it's really one of the most famous endings in all of film. You know, really, a classic tearjerker, you know, of course, yes. But I think the reason it sticks so well, is for two reasons. First, it's like it's well earned. You know, it's like you've gone through a lot of shit it's like it's a pretty dark film in many ways.
Yes. Yes.
And, you know, the ending is optimistic, but it's not like schmaltzy exactly.
No.
George is just like barely escaped. You know,
there's realism.
He doesn't destroy Potter with a fucking grenade launcher or something. You know, he just barely makes it, you know, and Potter isn't, you know, hasn't been reconciled with or anything like that. And then secondly, I think it points out something that's missing. You know, I think it's not a coincidence that so many Americans like react instinctively to this. It's like there's a void in their own lives that is shaped like a whole big community of people that they all know and trust and care about and would, you know, do, you know, anything to help. That doesn't exist for most people. You know, I think a lot of people, particularly men, don't have a big network of, you know, friends and community and family. You live in fairly anonymous kind of suburbia. You know, you see that, and boy, doesn't it sound nice. Wouldn't it be nice to know the people that you see frequently and to be able to like ask, you know, like hundreds of different people for help if you ever needed it? That is how things used to work to some degree. You know, there are always been people left out, especially in this country, but it didn't always used to be that you were anonymous pinballs in the capitalist market space, just sort of going.
But don't forget, yeah, even then, the George Baileys of the world were encouraged by capitalism to have a meaningful life by escaping all of that.
Yep.
Right. And by saying, I wish I had $1 million, hot dog. Right. And by like being inculcated to think that really what you want is to escape community, get out of this small town, do something great, be the hero of your life. And so, you know, we still have that, but we don't even have the refuge, of those kind of relationships that, you know, in certain communities were not yet destroyed by global capitalism, in the many ways that they have been since. Right. And I don't think it's just a temporal thing. I think it's something that we could recapture because the principles are the same. You know, the principles of we can have a better life is possible. What kind of vision do you have for the good life, and what does it entail for you and for others? It seems harder these days. It seems so much harder these days to just, it would be nice to have a group of friends and family that's like literally situated physically in the same area that we can cultivate relationships with, and where people are stable and like, it is maybe part of why I cried so much during the film, but maybe especially in the pandemic where the social fabric being torn apart was so obvious. It's a simple kind of vision, but it is one I think increasingly rare in this country, especially.
Yeah. And another thing maybe to mention about the vision here is that it's not like maudlin, small town is good, big town bad type of stuff. You hear that, it's like the Thomas Jefferson bullshit. Sam Wainwright, he's not a bad guy. He's a businessman and he's very successful, but he comes to George's help when he needs it as well. He's shown to be wealthy, but decent. Because he's a real, you could quibble at this kind of politics, but like, he's a real producer. Like he has a factory that makes things. He's not just about owning shit and like extracting the surplus from like, tenants and whatnot. But I think more broadly, like in this, by the same token with Harry being a war hero, going out to fight in war and be a war hero, that's fine. What it's saying is that, it's fine to go be a, like make your fortune if that's, what happens to be okay for you, what happens to work out, or to go be a war hero. But it's also okay to stay in your little town and just sort of make things. And that is just as valuable and just as worthy as being a big time, sort of.
Not only that, not only that, but like, Harry the war hero and Sam Wainwright are both almost like accidental heroes.
Yeah.
Right? Whereas like almost anyone could be a true citizen, and like the decision to influence moving Sam Wainwright's factory back to Bedford Falls, right? That helped way more people, and it's like the film shows these accidental heroes as being in some way fine, but nowhere near as valorized as like the simple citizen who understands the value of the common good in serving the people he's bound up with together, not just his family, but the actual community. And all it takes is like a simple recognition of that interdependence and that like idea of a good that's beyond your own,
Yeah.
And it takes a little bit of courage. And you'll notice that like the film starts with him wanting to commit suicide because he's discouraged. And instead what you need is the kind of the courage that comes from, being affirmed in what you do and what you can do as being meaningful. And that meaning takes place in what you do in the world and how it affects others. I think the other thing is it's not a utopia in the sense that like Potter still exists in Bedford Falls, and he's he's forceful and powerful and harm and creates. So like the beautiful vision is still a power struggle, right? Pottersville is simply where the war is over. Like the bad guys have won and they've destroyed the social fabric. The good vision is still one where good has to battle evil, and, civic virtue and moral courage and all of the things that those relationships foster still have to be kind of, dynamically opposed to the forces of capitalism that would try to unravel them. And I think that's also an important takeaway too, is that the politics of socialism, the politics of fostering the common good, you don't ever achieve it. Like it's not ever done. It's a way of life that has a certain vision of justice. And that means certain people you serve, certain people you oppose. And the meaning is in what you do and who you are because of what you do and who you're committed to. And that I think is a beautiful thing, right? And it doesn't mean that the person with the most, medals of honor or the most money is the best, but instead the community is best served by being bound together, and whoever helps hold it together is the most essential in a way.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's right. And yeah, this maybe, is to kind of close out the conversation here is a place you could maybe argue, because this is definitely different from kind of the Marxian dialectical approach in that Potter still exists. Like there's still like a single guy who owns like most of the businesses in the town, and they're just like one scrappy upstart that is fighting him. And so I think you're right to say, as a matter of like historical plausibility, that you're always going to be fighting. The great contest between egalitarianism and hierarchy is never going to end as long as, human beings exist. But you could imagine a situation in which the Mr. Potters of the world get their, wealth gradually expropriated, in part or in full. Like Norway has gone 3/4 of the way there. If you exclude owner-occupied housing, the Norwegian state owns 3/4 of all of the means of production. And that, so
that's right. No, here's the thing, right, Ryan? This is a film about one man, and one man who was a true political actor. Right. Well, and this is in the Arendtian sense of someone who understands action as being in the public sphere, who defines themselves in who they are in these critical moments of public action. And like, you can imagine that leadership inspiring others to similarly oppose Potter, right? And you can imagine this microcosm of like subject formation where people become true citizens, and where that like orientation to the common good is something that becomes contagious, so that the forces that are embodied in the figure of a Potter are overcome and overthrown. And just like you suggest, whether it's in certain states like Norway, you can imagine a future where people simply don't put up with these hierarchies and these power dynamics, and they simply, overthrow and determine for themselves a freer, better world where we live together with a mode of production that gives rise to social relations of freedom, equality, and throwing off the yoke of oppression and atomized greed and profit motive. It's a way of life we can not only imagine, but we can enact and fight for. And I do think that that's a thing that we have to believe can be done, and we should fight for it.
Yeah, it's absolutely possible. I think the interesting question in terms of socialism is how much further you could go beyond where Norway has, expropriating 3/4 of the means of production through some kind of gradual process.
Imagine if we were doing this podcast in Norway, we'd be fucking ripping into the government and like talking about how reactionary it is. Right?
Yeah. The conservatives are in charge. That's a kind of interesting, you could maybe chalk it up to Norway being kind of a peculiar country, but Norwegian conservatives are not like American conservatives. And I think it's not a coincidence that they're starting from this gigantic high plateau of social welfare and state ownership of the means of production. And when they get in charge, they're like, well, I guess we'll privatize some of this. Maybe a little bit, not too much, because people will be fucking pissed if we cut welfare. People love their welfare, and
yep.
And
look what's happening. Look what's happening right now with the $2,000 check thing for the stimulus, the pandemic stimulus. This might be a critical point where like, wait, both parties can just like do that. They could just agree and just send us checks. Like, okay, let's do that.
Yeah. People love that welfare. You know what I like? You know what I like is a check for $2,000, like that
every month, baby.
That makes me feel good.
Wait, you can just do that?
Yeah,
oh, yes, do that.
You can. Yeah, you could do that for a solid year, I think, before you'd see the slightest negative consequence. But anyway, I think that about wraps it up for me in terms of
a better world is possible.
Yeah.
Right. That's the takeaway.
Yeah. A better world. I think, this is probably a sort of, unrealistic kind of shined up the, aspects of like a 1940s society that were pretty terrible. Race is probably the biggest, lacuna in It's a Wonderful Life. Mm-hmm. There's one black character, I think, who's like a servant,
like the mammy.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Nevertheless, is not, it's not like a sort of racist, like caricature, like a sort of Birth of a Nation type of treatment. It just
not even gone with the wind. Come on.
Yeah. Casual condescension, I guess, but in a, maybe unintentionally, it just at least sort of semi-friendly, you might say. But another thing I notice as a major character is Martini, who's an Italian immigrant, a very caricatured Italian immigrant who gets one of George Bailey's homes. Yes. And it's an explicitly, pro-immigrant. He's got a million
bunch of kids
and a goat, and it's like,
and he ends up he has a bar called Martini. Yeah.
And it's very American dreamy in a way that really used to be much more true than it is today, at least. That like, if you could just get your feet under you in America, it really was possible in a way that it isn't in a lot of other countries, to sort of make a decent life for yourself. But that depends on the institutions being there to
that's the key. I think it's so important that this film says Martini didn't succeed because he was a hardworking immigrant, right?
Yep.
And like, he doesn't, it's such a clear, description of people's successes and failures being institutionally and socially determined in ways that have very little to do with like individual merit or effort or anything like that, but more about like the ethos and the kind of society that we collectively create. And so that's why like it's so beautiful to say not only are we there for each other when like social welfare, when some people have terrible accidents that harm them and they need help, we help them, but also when some people like have these amazing successes, that's almost as accidental or is as accidental as the tragic, like Mr. Gower, who almost went to jail for almost poisoning someone because he was so distraught that his son died that he almost like killed somebody by putting poison in the medicine. And like, because how arbitrary is it that he had George Bailey of all people to work for him as a kid who was astute enough and had the courage enough to not just deliver the medicine as he was directed, right?
Yeah.
Like that is such an arbitrary thing that's basically saved this guy's life. But on the other hand, when people are successful, it's also often as arbitrary. I have people and students who say, well, isn't it great that the secretaries of Apple or Google at the early years, became millionaires and they're just administrative assistants. And like, well, that's pretty fucking arbitrary. Like, what about the person who applied for an admin position at the company next door that went out of business?
Yeah.
In other words, like, shouldn't we treat our successes and failures as something that we're bound up together with it? And so like capitalism still has this arbitrariness in punishing and rewarding people that I think socialism wants to get rid of and wants to say we're in it together for the good and the bad. Let's spread the wealth around and share in the successes and also protect each other from the harms. And isn't that a much more beautiful, isn't that like the Christmas spirit? Right? Isn't the Christmas? So we haven't talked about the connection to Christmas. Merry Christmas, everybody. Right? Like this is a rents natality, like new beginnings, transfiguration, transformation, the birth of something new, but also the ability to cleanse and understand how, miraculous life is and how precious it is and how much we should value each other and be with each other and have that comradely spirit. I'm saying comradely wrong now. I don't know what's wrong with me. Comradely? I guess that's it.
Combu-radly?
Solidarity, baby. You know what I'm saying.
Yeah.
So Merry Christmas, everyone. We should raise our drinks to each other and be there for each other and realize that we're bound up together. That's all.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, if you strip away the dross, and you look hard at the history of innovation and technology and, human motivation, you see that, we can run this great technological cornucopia without having to give so much of the proceeds to like 10 guys. And they are almost all guys, like Jeff Bezos, like Elon Musk, like, the surviving Koch brothers. Saying that you people who don't even really understand your gigantic enterprises in any sort of systematic fashion, you're necessary to the functioning of this system. No, you're not. We can break these businesses up into many pieces and or take them into state ownership, as the case may be, and they'll work just fine. The Norwegian state is running all of these things. So many, like a huge oil company, the biggest bank, the biggest telecom in Norway. It's hard to imagine that even the U.S. government could run like Comcast and JP Morgan Chase any worse than the current owners of it today. Shit, I could do that by myself. Just stop doing money laundering for drug cartels and terrorists. That's what we call a Christmas bonus right there. And yeah, so just basically that like the moral underpinning of the current utterly shitty hierarchical society that we live in, which is just, the latest news today, the last couple of days, is that 400,000 people have died this since the pandemic started. That's more than
unnecessarily.
Yeah,
unnecessarily.
Excess deaths over what would have happened. And that is more than World War II casualties in the United States, which were, comparatively modest, compared to like Russia or Germany, or, a number of other countries. But still, this is going to be the worst mass casualty event since the influenza pandemic. It really isn't, the way that
let's just say Pottersville, they would not fucking wear masks, right?
Yes.
And Bedford Falls, they would wear masks.
Absolutely. Yeah. That's precisely what I was inexpertly, grasping towards is that, yeah. I mean, and just more broadly that like that many people could die and no one would give a shit, or that like,
yes,
I mean,
that's right.
People do care, but like the society is not caring in any specific way. Trump doesn't give a shit, and therefore
the action is not being taken. Yeah. It's not being prevented.
Right. I mean, they were deliberately trying to infect the people. I mean, this is the president, yes. And therefore 40% of the population. And if I'm convinced that all else aside, all the other fucking horrible shit that is in American history, if we had the egalitarian income distribution of the 1970s and, the strong unions of the 1970s and the strong regulations of the 1970s, Trump never would have been president. And the United States response to the COVID pandemic would have been orders of magnitude better than it has been. Maybe not perfect.
That's right.
There's much room even in those circumstances for a better response, but not the worst in the world. Not an abject international humiliation. And
no, that's right.
So that
look, the failures are not just the administration that Trump was in charge of, although that was a big part of it. It's not just the various governors and mayors, although they were part of it. But it is also capitalism, neoliberalism, and the ethos that has been permeating our lives and informing us as people. Because if we truly were like George Bailey, if we truly felt like George Bailey had just almost committed suicide and he was rescued because he saved somebody's life and that rescued his life. But like even early on when he's, talking to Clarence the Angel, he's like, are you okay? I'm worried about you, right? Like,
yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and if we just, and it's a chicken and the egg thing, cause as we just said, like the structures in the society forms you to a degree, forms us to a degree. But if we were the kind of people who were like that, we would not put up with these laws, these structures, these politicians. We would act. And that's what love is action. And that's what George Bailey shows, is that he shows his love to people through his actions, through his courage, through his fighting for justice. And I feel like it's a chicken and the egg thing. Rousseau's paradox is, how do you create a democratic people? How do you create democratic institutions from an undemocratic people, right? It's a chicken and the egg thing, right? Because the institutions produce the people, but we have to do it. We have to do it, right? We have to be the agents that undo the structures that form people in this perverse and dark way. And that's the miracle that Christmas could offer. The idea of transfiguration, of transformation, of being born anew. This is Arendt's idea of natality, that with new generations, literally new people coming into the world, but also every moment, action is something to begin. The Greek is, to act in ancient Greek means to begin something anew, right? We can begin anew and we should do it together, because, that's where the good life and a wonderful life is waiting in that new initiative born through a vision for, serving each other through love and commitment, instead of greed and avarice and kind of the dark, sick world of Pottersville.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I think, is why It's a Wonderful Life is worth watching today, because unlike many attempted democracies, we actually have a very rich democratic tradition, however flawed it may be, to draw on, and a rich heritage of art, and literally one of the most popular movies in the history of the United States to draw upon, and many heroes in our national pantheon who, as flawed as they may be and incomplete, are still on our side. And
yes,
that's why I say, Merry Christmas, folks, and
Merry Christmas, everybody, and happy holidays. Bless you, whether you're an atheist, agnostic, Christian, Muslim, of any faith, Wicca, whatever it may be. We at Left Anchor wish you peace and joy and healing and solidarity, and we're here for all of you. Let us know how we can serve and help you, because we believe in each other. We believe in you. And I love you, Coops, and I know that we're doing the best we can. I hope you're all doing the best you all can to take care of yourselves and of each other, because at the end of the day, that's where it starts and that's where it ends. Is just being good to yourselves and each other and seeing what we can do anew.
Back at you, man. And thanks for listening, everybody. Have a great holiday, and have a great Christmas feast, hopefully, of some description. And we'll see you in the next episode.